Lesson 11 already. They fly by every quarter, but it seems like more quickly every single time. So it's almost time for our new books to be getting here. But this lesson is based on John chapter 11, as well as John chapter 14 and John chapter 20, looking at Thomas, the next in the list of gospel characters that we've been looking at. So, the 12 apostles who were selected by Jesus, we know they were with him throughout his whole ministry. They heard Jesus teach. They saw Jesus perform miracles. They followed Jesus wherever he went. And although some of them are mentioned fairly frequently, some are not. Some of them are hardly ever mentioned, but each of them were important. We might even say equally important. They all served as witnesses ultimately after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. And one of those men that Jesus chose was named Thomas. Besides being listed as one of the 12, and then being with the apostles when Jesus appeared by the Sea of Galilee, Thomas is not mentioned very much at all. In fact, only 3 other times. He's mentioned when he confirmed his allegiance to Jesus in John 11. They're all in John, by the way. John 11, verse 16. He's mentioned when he asked Jesus to explain further about him saying that he was leaving them and going somewhere else that they can't go in chapter 14. And then when he doubted Jesus' most recent appearance because he wasn't there when it happened, and then was given the opportunity to touch the body of Jesus in chapter 20. Sadly, as we'll see later on, he's mainly known for that last one. As soon as you hear the name Thomas in the context of the Bible, you probably already are thinking about doubting, because that's what he's called. It's a terrible nickname to be remembered by, because it's not the only thing he ever did. That's just one thing he did, and he didn't even do that very long. It didn't take long, at least as far as he had the chance. It was almost instant, the turnaround. But he's known as Doubting Thomas. He's never called that in the Scriptures, that I've ever seen anyway, but that's how he's known today. And that's not really fair, as we'll see, hopefully, in our lesson here this morning, which doesn't begin in John chapter 20. It begins in John chapter 11. So, in John chapter 11, it's a very famous chapter because it is the chapter where Jesus is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. It's mostly known for that. And, of course, the shortest verse in the English Bible, Jesus wept, in verse 35. But leading up to that, we know that Jesus he was very close with this little family, as they seem to have been, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And so whenever Lazarus got sick and apparently got worse, his sisters called for Jesus to come and heal him. And despite the urgency of that situation, Jesus, we're told, didn't rush at all to Bethany. He made no rush. In fact, it says that he stayed where he was for 2 more days before he left. And the disciples sort of resisted his plans to go to Bethany, which was in Judea, by the way, because the Jews were seeking to stone him, they said, which was true. So their thought was, should he really take such a risk to go to Judea? Is it really necessary to put himself in that kind of danger? Well, Jesus replied to them that one who walks in the day avoids stumbling. It's not the clearest thing he could have said to them at that moment, but it wasn't unusual for his manner of speaking. But ultimately, his point was, I'm going to do God's will. Doesn't matter what happens. Whatever the risk is, whatever the danger is, I'm going to do the will of my Father. So persecution or the threat of persecution is not going to keep him from Judea. He was going to go there. He said, I'm going to go there to awaken Lazarus. Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I'm going to go wake him up. Now, at that, they would have thought he's even crazier. Why would you need to go to Judea to wake him up? Don't you think he'll be awake by the time you get there, Lord? Not going to be asleep that long. But then finally Jesus spoke more plainly, and he said, Lazarus has died. He has died. Fallen asleep was a common euphemism for dying with Jesus and the apostles. Paul used it a lot. Common way to refer to somebody who's died. They've fallen asleep. So then he says, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. So let's go, he says. Let's go to Lazarus, to Judea, and this is where Thomas speaks up. He speaks up and says, let us also go, so that we may die with him. Now, we've made a point in some of these lessons that whenever you're reading words, there are some things that are missing, like tone and facial expression and maybe just the whole vibe of the room or whatever that we don't get unless we're told, and usually you're not told those kinds of details. But so we don't know exactly what his attitude may have been when he said this. Is he being sort of grumbly, or is he being bold and courageous and saying, let's go so we can die too? I'm not so sure, to be honest. It could go either way. But no matter what he had in mind when he said it, he still seemed to intend to do it, if that was what's going to happen. So even if he was like, well, might as well go with him, he's going to die when he goes, so we might as well go and die too. He still meant what he said. So he still was going to, he still suggested, let's go too. And he was willing to die with Jesus if that's what was going to happen. Obviously, him in that verse is not Lazarus, but is Jesus in the context. Even though Jesus just referred to him, based on what the disciples had last said, when Thomas said, die with him, he meant Jesus, die with Jesus. So he's going to follow the Lord. No matter how foolish it seemed to him, unnecessary, risky, dangerous, Thomas, give him credit, he was going to go with him. He could have said, all right, if you want to do that, you go right ahead. I ain't going. You can stay. I'll stay. You can go. You're the Lord anyway, so you might be able to, get away with some things that we might not be able to get away with. So you just go and we'll stay here and we'll see when you get back. But that wasn't his attitude at all. He said, let's go, that we may die with him. Not so much the doubter in that case. Any thoughts, comments on that part from chapter 11? All right then, chapter 14. A few days later, on the night that Jesus was going to be betrayed, Jesus spoke to his disciples for a pretty lengthy discussion. He knew that they were really heavy in heart, concerned, burdened by the stress and worry of anxiety of the situation. So he told them in John chapter 14, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you," is the reading according to the ASV. "And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I'm going." Again, not exactly the clearest, but what they seemed to hold on to most of all was, or Thomas at least, is the fact that Jesus said, "You know the way to where I'm going." He didn't tell him where he was going necessarily, exactly. He implied he's going to his Father's house. He's going somewhere to prepare a place for them, but he doesn't say explicitly where. But then he says, "You know the way to where I'm going." Not just you know where I'm going, but you know the way. And this is when Thomas speaks up. And Thomas said, "Lord, we don't even know where you're going. So how can we know the way to where you're going?" That's not an unreasonable question, I don't think. Seems like common sense. We don't know where you're going, so how can we know how to get there? Now you tell us where you're going. Maybe that's true that we know the way, but you didn't even tell us where you're going, so we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way to where you're going? And Jesus' answer was, "I am the way and the truth and the life." That verse is quoted very often, but not usually with the verse before it, is it? "No one comes to the Father except through me." Can't separate them really when he says, "How can we know the way?" And Jesus' response was, the very first words of his response, "I am the way." Which he goes further into when he says, "No one comes to the Father except through me." Where am I going? I'm going to the Father. What is the way to the Father? I am. No one comes to the Father except through me. So Jesus wasn't talking about an actual destination that he was going, that you know the way to get to, the way you would get anywhere on earth. But where he's going, you can't get there on earth. It's not on earth. You can't get there in the physical universe, because it's not even in the physical universe. But the only way to get to where he's going, which is the Father's house, or the Father himself, both are the same thing, is through him. And that will be further explained later in the gospel, or at least in other places in the gospel. But we're looking at Thomas in this and his role as the questioner. So it was he that spoke up and was like, "Lord, wait a minute." Now, there are plenty of times in the New Testament where we get the impression, and when we're explicitly told, the disciples were sometimes afraid to ask questions. For whatever reason. Sometimes they didn't want to ask because they didn't want the answer, which is true many times for us. You may not want to know the answer, so you don't even ask. Other times, they seem to be afraid of looking stupid or little of faith, because they had been rebuked before, and they're like, "Well, maybe I should think on this a little more before I ask the question and make sure that this is the question I want to ask." So again, give credit where credit's due. Thomas was not afraid, at least on this occasion, to ask for more instruction. And I don't know of a time when Jesus ever responded unfavorably to someone sincerely seeking more instruction. Give us a little bit more. He certainly didn't respond unfavorably here. He didn't say, "Oh, Thomas, you're about the dumbest apostle I picked."
But I'm not sure that he's the only person that, because Jesus knows most everything anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, the rest of them could have
They probably were. I don't think there's any way that they just got it, you know. And they looked at Thomas like, Thomas, you don't get it? Thomas doesn't get it. You know, we get it. They may have acted like that, but they knew they didn't get it either. But Thomas was the one who had the courage to speak up because he genuinely wanted to know. And again, it's a very reasonable question. If we don't know where you're going, how can we know the way to where you're going? And he said, basically his answer sort of informed Thomas, I'm not talking about physical things. I'm not talking about a physical place. But through me, the way you get to where I'm going, which I've just told you is my Father's house, is through me. So as long as you're in me or with me, that's how you get there. And that translates later into being in his church, his body. Being in the body of Christ is the same as being in Christ. And being in Christ is the only way to get to the Father's house. So being in Christ or in the church is the only way to get to the Father's house, which is heaven. That's what the Bible teaches about that. We could maybe have already addressed that in our sermon series, but we could add that to the list probably. Yes, sir.
But he says, "I am the way," in that verse,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, okay, but Thomas still doesn't understand what's going on.
Yeah, he still doesn't fully understand.
Yeah.
So in time he would. He just needed more time.
Yeah.
And that's true for a lot of us. Some of us still need more time. I think everybody will always need more time to understand not even everything. Nobody will ever understand everything, but even to understand a lot of things, we'll need more time. And the key is to be like Thomas and want to know. Seek it. Search. Starts in the heart. Notice also that when Jesus says, "Let not your hearts be troubled," the implication is they have a choice. They can choose to have confidence instead of doubt. They can choose to have hope instead of despair. It's a choice. It's not always an easy choice, but it is a choice. It's a matter of perspective and having confidence in Him, really. So he says, here's some reasons you can be confident and hopeful. First of all, because of me, my existence, who I am. Jesus was and is God, came to the earth to do the Father's will. He didn't allow man to ruin any of his efforts, his plan. He said, because heaven awaits the faithful, in verse 2 there. He didn't try to tell them or lead them to believe he wasn't leaving, because he was. He didn't try to tell them that he wasn't going to suffer and die from persecution, but he did, because he was going to. But he did tell them that when he left, it would allow him the opportunity to prepare a place for them later. Heaven is that place. And all the things that they were worried about him suffering, and themselves suffering for that matter, is not present there in that place. No death, no crying, no sorrow, no pain. We need to understand we're strangers and pilgrims on the earth and live in preparation for eternity. And then he said, because he's going to return. Verse 3. So, because of his existence and who he was, because heaven awaits the faithful, and because he's going to return. Just like the angel said right after his ascension. So, what are you looking up there? He's going to come back. Same way he went up. He's going to come again, not to die for mankind, but to judge both the living and the dead. Matthew 25, 31 through 46. Acts 17, 30 and 31. 2 Corinthians 5, 10 and 11. So Thomas begged for more instruction, and he got some more instruction. He may have wanted more, but he did get some at least, and he is the one that asked. And finally, chapter 20 Thomas the doubter. So after Jesus' resurrection, he appeared to the disciples on several occasions. He appeared to many people, but he appeared multiple times to his apostles. He appeared to them on the day that he arose from the dead, we're told here. And verse 24 says, Thomas was not with them. Where was he? Don't know. I can tell you where he wasn't. I don't know where he was. He wasn't there. He was somewhere else. So when he got there, it says, verse 25, the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. But he said to them, no, you didn't. Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I'll never believe that you saw him, that is. Now this is what Thomas is remembered for. This statement. Nevertheless, he may get a bad rap, not just because this wasn't characteristic of him in general, but it wasn't actually that outrageous of a statement, if you think about it.
And Jesus didn't rebuke him for it, like later when he saw him.
Yeah, Jesus, he may have gotten close, and we'll see by the second part of his response, but he didn't really rebuke him in the way that he rebuked his apostles on other occasions. But he's simply saying, and again, this is the day, the resurrection day. Jesus has only been dead for 3 days. And they would all still have been extremely heavy with grief and total confusion, guilt. And so, how would you respond if you walked into the room with the apostles, your fellow apostles, the 10 other apostles, and they said, we saw the Lord?
I would have been mad that I wasn't there.
Yeah, and I bet he was a little bit. But he, at the moment, was just overcome with, he just couldn't bring himself to believe it. And before we just, drag him through the mud, remember how Peter responded whenever the woman came and told him and John that she saw the Lord. They didn't believe her. So Thomas isn't the only one that thought in this way. He's not saying, I will never believe no matter what. And again, we have to understand, in the context, he means believe that you have seen him, believe that he appeared here, not believe that he is who he says he was, that we've believed he is all along. I don't know why he suddenly, I don't think there's any indication that any of the apostles decided that he must not be the Christ after all when he died. That's why they were so confused, because they couldn't make sense of it. Well, how could he be? We know he's the Christ, but he just let himself be killed. How does this work? But he means I won't believe that you've seen him. Well, the Lord, for reasons his own, made Thomas wait another 8 days. 8 days later, John says, they were all inside again, except this time Thomas was there. Same exact setting, it seems anyway. The only difference being Thomas was there too. And the doors were locked. And yet here's Jesus. Jesus came and stood among them, and greeted them. Peace be with you. But then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. You know, one of the interesting things about this whole account is that it seems to suggest that Thomas didn't even do what he said he didn't do it. He didn't have to touch him. He didn't have to put his hands in there. He didn't have to do what he said he would have to do in order to believe. As soon as Jesus appeared and invited him to do it, Thomas answered him, and that was enough. So it's not exactly fair for Thomas to be remembered as the doubter, because as soon as the second Jesus appeared in his presence, that was it. That's all he needed. He just wanted to see him himself. And don't you pretend like you wouldn't also, if you had the opportunity, that you would like to also, wouldn't you? He just wanted proof. And Jesus was never against offering proof. In fact, God in general has never been against proof. He couldn't possibly give us any more proof of believing in His own existence, for that matter. Every single ounce of evidence all over the earth, all over not just the earth, the whole universe, suggests and leaves only one possible explanation, and that is that the very way the Bible begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And Jesus was all about offering proof of His identity, wasn't He? What else was His ministry for? Yeah, to teach, but didn't He do more than teach? He healed people. He raised people from the dead. At least three people. Healed and expelled of demons more than we could even count. Every single one of those was an offer of proof of His identity. So Jesus wasn't against people needing proof. If He was, He wouldn't have given any proof and said, you just have to believe. Here's my teaching. Love each other. And don't hurt people. Now believe that I'm the Messiah, the Christ, because I told you to, and you better believe it no matter what. But aside from His teaching, if we even want to say that much, everything that Jesus did in His ministry was offering people proof, evidence of who He was. That's why so many people believed in Him, because there was no other explanation for what He did. Just like we looked at with Nicodemus. We know that you're a teacher come from God because nobody can do these things unless God's with him.
Even in that example there, I mean, there's a lot that we don't know that happened in that 8 days, but it's like, obvious no one was texting going, Thomas doesn't believe it was you.
Yeah.
And this is what he said he needed as proof. So him appearing and telling him exactly the thing that he said he would need to believe without going, without knowing that. How would he know that if it wasn't Jesus?
Yeah. Thomas answered him, who you been talking to, Lord?
Wait, who told you that?
Yeah. And the fact that John even mentions 8 days later, that's probably not how this would have played out if somebody just made this up. If John had just made this up, if I wrote this and made it up, when I would have had Jesus appear is right when Thomas said that. Unless I see him myself, I'll never believe. Boom, there he is. What'd you say, Thomas? Say it again. Say it to my face. And then Thomas says, my Lord and my God, please forgive me. I'm sorry. But 8 days later, for what? Don't know. That's just a fact. Jesus, he appeared 8 days later. Maybe every day that passed, Thomas was like, see, told you guys, you didn't see him. Probably not, but
You need that time to work through things. When you were talking about the grief, the shock, the disbelief, if someone told you the
Yeah.
Don't play with me like that, you know, like, why, how, no, there's no way. I mean, why would he not make sure we were all together? I mean, you would just start doubting a lot of things, not doubting Jesus, but doubting those that are telling you.
Yeah, he's not doubting Jesus. He's not even necessarily, maybe this is borderline, he's not even necessarily doubting that Jesus is alive. But strictly speaking, he's just doubting that he was there. Now, maybe by implication, he's doubting that he was there because he is doubting that he was even alive. But based on the text itself, the main thing he's doubting is that he had been there. Yeah, Jam?
We were talking about that, and it's like, he's there, but he wasn't at the time when Jesus was.
Yeah.
He was, so to me, that seems like it wasn't anyone's fault except Thomas.
Yeah.
At that time. Thomas could have been there at any time.
Maybe Thomas he probably should have believed them when they told him, because these were his mates, you know. These were his fellow. They were an elite group of people, not elite in the sense of, you know, being better than everybody else, but just small group.
That's what I'm getting to. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like he has to see it from them. Like, these are his mates, like you just said. He has to believe them, because it's like, if you don't believe what they say, then how are you going to believe them at all?
Yeah. He could have trusted them. He knew he could have trusted them. But again, he was in this state of disbelief in general because of what's just happened. That turned his whole world upside down. And all of them. And along with the bitterness of not having been there whenever it happened, we can totally put ourselves in his shoes and understand. But like was mentioned, Jesus does not explicitly rebuke him for doubting. He maybe steps on the line, okay, because he says, "Have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." That may have been pointed at Thomas. We know it was pointed at Thomas in the sense of he said it directly to Thomas, because it says he did. But maybe that was just a very as gentle a rebuke as you could possibly imagine to Thomas, same as saying, you should have believed. You should have believed even though you didn't see, because you know them, and they're not going to lie to you. They're not going to lie. All of them are saying it. It's not just one or two of them saying it. They're all saying he was here. But more than that, what Jesus says in verse 29 could be applied to us, because we all fall in that category. Not of people who have not seen any proof. God has never asked, and I stand by this statement, God has never expected a single human being to believe anything for which he did not offer proof. Never. God has never asked anybody or expected any human being to believe anything that they have no reason to believe from the beginning of time. And if you just read through the Bible, you'll see that everything, God, people, this is why the world defines faith. If you look in the dictionary, faith, it's one of the worst definitions I ever heard. In almost any dictionary you can look in that suggests things like believing in something even though there's no evidence to believe it, or believing it even though there's evidence to the contrary. That's what faith is, the world says. That's totally wrong as far as the Bible is concerned. Biblical faith is not believing in something even though there's no evidence to support it. It's believing in something that there is evidence to support and acting accordingly. That's what faith is. It's not believing something even though there's no reason to believe it, because God, who created us, knows that He gave us reasoning ability in the first place. And He expects us to use it both in every aspect of life, in every area of life, including spiritual life. So Thomas was simply seeking proof. And as soon as he got that proof, he believed. And I can't help but think that during that 8 days, he was wrestling with it in his mind, and it had to have gotten brought up. What better thing would they have to talk about? If that hadn't happened, they probably wouldn't have had much to talk about at all. They would have had a lot to think about, but it wouldn't have come out in conversation probably, because they would have been reflecting on that they just seen Jesus killed. But now, 10 of the apostles saw Jesus. So that's going to be the main thing they're talking about, because that totally trumps the other thing, doesn't it? Well, we saw he was killed, but now we know that he's not dead somehow. And the tomb's empty. Now what does all this mean? So they would have been talking about that for that week. And Thomas probably would have been wrestling with it in his own mind, maybe remembering, after all, the Lord told us this was going to happen. More than once. He said, I'm going to suffer at the hands of the chief priests and the elders and the Pharisees, and they're going to kill me, and on the third day I'm going to rise. He said that to them. More than once.
He could have gone to the tomb that day.
Yeah, he could have gone.
For himself like Peter and actually he very well may have believed, even though without seeing on that very day, without another week passing by.
What else is he going to do? I mean, they didn't know what to do in general, so might as well go check it out if they had the courage to do it. Okay, let me go see it one more time. Let me go check.
And it looks like he wasn't going to miss another opportunity to see the Lord, because the next time you see the Lord appears, Thomas is there.
He's right there. This is as far as I remember, the first time we see any connection with Thomas and fishing. He wasn't one of the ones that are said to be a fisherman. That was Simon, Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James and John. So Thomas is the outlier in that list of names in the next chapter. Peter says, I'm going fishing, and they said, hey, we'll go with you. But Thomas is right there. Nathaniel being the other standout, I guess. Thomas wanted to double check. Nothing wrong with double checking. There's a lot right with it in general. Don't you double check things? How many times you check your alarm before you go to sleep? I know some people who check it about 35 and a half times. It says the same thing every time. But after that 35th time, this person happens to be confident in their alarm.
I make myself stop.
Instead of just creating 6 different alarms on your phone like I do,
I do make multiple alarms.
she has to check the one alarm 35 times. Not naming any names. So Thomas may have been like, you know what, I've already seen it. I've already been told this. I want to go see it again. He goes to the tomb maybe. Tomb's empty. So he died. Tomb's empty. The others say that he was here. Well, if he's not there, who's to say that he wasn't here? You know, he's somewhere. And every single instance of the disciples also struggling to believe also proves that they didn't have anything to do with it, as people sometimes suggest, as the Jews themselves made up. We'll pay you this money, and you go around and tell people that his disciples came by night and stole his body. Disciples didn't even have any clue about it. They didn't even believe that his body wasn't there. And still aren't fully comprehending what in the world happened. So we don't have the ability to do what Thomas did. Jesus isn't going to appear here this morning and tell everybody, hey, look, it's me. Touch me and you'll see. Besides, that wouldn't even make sense to us because we didn't know him. Thomas knew it. He had been with him for 3.5 years at least and knew Jesus. So when Jesus says, hey, look, it's me, it would have meant something to him because he knew him. But the thing that we do have the ability to do is examine the evidence that supports Christianity and everything related to Christianity. Examine the evidence. That's, at the end of the day, that's what Thomas was wanting to do. We can do that. We have evidence. We can base our faith and our belief in the gospel on credible testimony. That's what people do, isn't it? With everything. I bet you believe in some things that you have never experienced firsthand. You've never seen. It's never happened to you, but you believe it because of the credible testimony, or maybe the incredible testimony of people even. So when there's credible testimony, which people don't seem to have any problem believing in every other area, like Homer, for instance, the old writer, Greek writer, Iliad, Odyssey. Do you believe that he existed? If you have an opinion at all, you probably do. Those books exist and they have his name on them. I've never seen him. But I believe he existed, and I believe he wrote those books because there's reason to believe it. There's credible testimony. Anything else, I believe it, even though I can't say that I've seen him or met it or know that firsthand. Well, how come when we turn to the Bible, all of a sudden it's automatically guilty until proven innocent? Made up, far-fetched, just because it may say some things that we struggle to accept. Now, if the Bible said Jesus was an alien and he came from Mars, a lot more people would believe it. Isn't that crazy? Aliens built the pyramids. Aliens created the world. How'd this happen? How'd that happen? Aliens, 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 every time. Now that's something I could jump on board with, you know. Aliens. But God? No, man made God up. When there's a universe full of evidence for God's existence and what the Bible teaches about God, and zilch to suggest aliens even exist, extraterrestrial aliens.